The old man stepped onto the dusty sidewalk with boots that had seen more deserts than most would ever know. His hands were calloused thick and marked with small scars of metal and time. His coat was worn faded at the elbows and shoulders, a deep green one, sharp, now dulled by years of sun and quiet memories. He paused outside the shop window, eyeing the rifles lined like soldiers behind the glass, each one gleaming, each one silent. The sign above the door was hand-painted, chipped but proud. Reed's Tactical and Outdoors. He remembered that name from years back, maybe in a different town, or maybe from someone who used to talk too much in a barracks somewhere. He pushed the door open, and the bell chimed, a sharp, clear sound that seemed to stop the conversations inside like it was an alarmed man behind the counter, young, maybe late 20s, with a beard to neat and boots to clean, looked up and gave that practiced smile, the kind that stops short of the eyes. The old man nodded, quietly walking past shelves of gear, knives, ammo, holsters, walking not like a customer but like someone surveying terrain, noting exits, measuring space. His eyes landed on a framed photo above the register, a younger man in full gear standing with a SEAL team, dust all around and the sun glaring from behind. The clerk caught the glance and stood straighter. "That's my brother," he said proudly. "Served in Team 3, real missions, real stuff, not like the weekend warriors around here." The old man didn't say anything. He just nodded again, looked over the rifles behind the counter, then finally spoke, his voice low and slow. "I'd like to see that Garand in the case behind you." The clerk raised an eyebrow. "The M1, that's not for sale, sir. Display only, and way out of most budgets anyway." The old man kept his eyes on it, fingers twitching slightly, not from nerves but from memory. He stepped a little closer. "I carried one like it through to continents. It's not for sale," the clerk repeated, firmer this time, and something shifted in his stance. Maybe it was the way the old man looked too long at the photo, or maybe it was something else invisible to anyone not paying attention. "Look, sir, we don't have time for stories or window shopping. This isn't a museum," the clerk said loud enough for the others in the store to hear. A couple heads turned. One man by the suppressors smirked quietly. The old man said nothing for a moment, then turned slowly, started walking to the door. The bell chimed again, but softer this time, and he stepped back into the heat of the afternoon sun with no rifle, no argument, no anger, just silence. Inside the shop, the conversation picked back up as if nothing had happened, but the clerk kept glancing at the door like something wasn't sitting right. "An older customer near the back said under his breath. "That man looked familiar." Someone else asked what was his name, but nobody knew. The clerk shrugged. "Probably some cranky vet who thinks his medals still count for something these days." Outside, the old man walked slowly, not because he was weak, but because he didn't rush. He knew how to wait, how to let time work for him. He walked 2 blocks down, took a right, and sat on a bench outside a diner. He didn't go in, he just sat, eyes on the gun shop in the distance, the reflection of the sun catching the window like a glint from a scope. He didn't move much, but his hand reached into his coat and pulled out a small device not much larger than a key fob and pressed a single button. "And are passed in that slow, hot way that only summer can stretch, like it wants you to sweat out the impatience." The clerk had just finished ringing up a customer for a scope when the bell over the door chimed again. This time the conversation didn't stop. It was slammed to the floor by the presence that walked in first, one, then 2, then 5 men, all in civilian clothes, but nothing about them was casual. They moved like shadows made solid, like wolves in jeans and boots, eyes scanning every corner with purpose. One in front, tall, clean-shaven eyes that didn't blink, stepped right up to the counter and stared at the clerk. The framed photo behind him caught the light now like a warning. "Where is he?" asked, voice level but cold. The clerk blinked once. "Who?" he managed to say. "The one you kicked out." The one who asked about the Garand there in the room seemed to thicken. Every customer went quiet again, but this time no one smirked. No one whispered. The clerk tried to recover a look. "If this is some kind of joke, I don't know who you think he was, but I don't have to serve anyone who makes me uncomfortable." "You don't have to serve anyone, that's true," the tall man said, "but you do have to respect the man who taught us how to walk into a room like this and own it, who bled in places you can't pronounce so you could sell plastic holsters in peace." The others didn't move, but they didn't have to. The tension spoke Loud enough one of them leaned in and said softly, "You know what's funny? We were going to surprise him today, haven't seen the old man in months, figured we'd show up together, maybe take him shooting or just get a drink and talk about the ones who didn't come back. Instead, we find out you threw him out like trash." The clerk swallowed hard, now unsure of everything, even his own name. The tall man stepped around the counter, walked over to the case where the M1 sat and stared at it long and slow, then back at the photo, that same man in younger days standing next to him in a different time, a different war, and suddenly the room didn't feel like a store anymore, it felt like a courtroom. Then came the last blow. One of the SEALs looked at the clerk and said, "You know what the old man's name is? Don't bother answering, you wouldn't believe it anyway." The man behind the counter stood frozen, his hands hovering above the glass display as if unsure whether to hide them, raise them, or rest them. He had never been trained for this, not for the weight of silence, not for the kind of authority that didn't need a badge or a title, not for the feeling that the walls themselves were watching him, judging him, waiting for his next mistake. The tall SEAL stepped back from the case, his eyes sweeping the room again as if to mark every face, every shelf, every shadow. The other man didn't speak, didn't move, just stood like statues carved out of fire and memory. "You don't know his name?" the tall man said again, this time not as a question but as a quiet certainty. "And that's all we needed to know, because if you did, if you had even the faintest idea who that man was, you would have stood when he entered, you would have offered him a chair before he even asked, you would have taken that M1 from the case and handed it over with both hands like a relic, because that man taught us what respect means, not just on the battlefield but in every damn moment of life since." Then the clerk opened his mouth to speak, but the words dried up in his throat like dust in a windstorm. The customers in the shop still said nothing, but something had shifted in the air, a strange heaviness that only comes when truth walks into a room and finds everything it needs to say written in silence. "You want his name? Fine," the tall man said, his voice steady as a slow-burning fuse. "His name is Samuel Royce. You probably never heard of him because men like him don't put themselves on billboards, they don't post videos, they don't brag, they carry their stories and scars, not in words. They train teams like ours, they lead us through things most people can't even imagine, and when it's over they don't ask for thanks, they ask for quiet." Another SEAL stepped forward, this one shorter with sharp eyes and a voice like gravel. "Sam Royce trained me when I was 22. I thought I was tough, thought I was ready, but he broke me down and built me again, not with cruelty but with precision, with patience. He didn't raise his voice unless it mattered, and when it did the whole base listened." The younger SEAL looked straight at the clerk. "He was the reason I survived Syria, the reason 2 of my brothers came home instead of getting zipped up in black bags, and you threw him out because his coat was old." The clerk's hands trembled now, a faint twitch that betrayed the weight of regret sinking into him 1 inch at a time. He looked at the photo on the wall, the same one he had been proud to point out an hour ago, and now it felt different. Now it felt like a lie hanging there, because the man who stood beside his brother in that picture was the same one he had dismissed like a drifter. "Ah, could make this public," the tall SEAL said. "We could put your shop's name on every veteran forum, every SEAL message board, every social feed from Coronado to Virginia Beach, but that's not what he'd want. That's not who he is. That's not what he taught us. What he taught us was that respect isn't something you demand, it's something you give first, something you carry like a weapon, even when it's heavy, even when it gets you nothing in return." The youngest among them, barely out of his 20s, stepped forward now, his voice quieter but no less firm. "Sam Royce was the first man who called me a warrior. He didn't say it when I earned my trident, he said it when I carried a teammate who got hit in the leg 3 miles through a dust storm and never once complained." Sam looked me in the eye and said, "You're ready now," and that meant more than any medal I ever got. The room was so still now, even the hum of the fluorescent lights seemed to pause. The clerk looked down at his hands like he no longer recognized them, then slowly looked up. His voice was small. "I didn't know." The tall man didn't nod, didn't offer comfort, because the truth was simple and heavy and unforgiving. "That's the problem. You didn't know, and you didn't care to a scone of the other seals walked over to the case, opened it himself without asking, and gently lifted the M1 Garand from its velvet cradle. He held it like it was made of history and blood and sacrifice, then walked past the counter and toward the door. Without a word, tall seal followed, and the others filed out behind them, leaving the clerk. Samuel Royce sat quietly on the bench, the weight of the M1 resting across his lap like a memory. He had never let go of his fingers, traced the wood slow and deliberate, not in admiration, but in recognition, the kind of touch you reserve for something that has walked with you through hell and back. He did not look at the rifle as much as he felt it. Each dent, each groove, each whisper in the grain spoke of the past, not just his, but of those who never came home, the men who had fallen before they could grow old and be mistaken for nothing more than a Burdenthe. Seals stood with him in silence, no formation, no salute, just presence. They knew better than to speak when the old man was listening to the ghosts. Some things were sacred, some moments demanded stillness. They had learned that from him years ago, when they were younger, faster, louder, when they still thought that winning a fight meant yelling the hardest. But Royce had taught them that the strongest men in the room were often the quietest. Finally looked up, his eyes scanning their faces as if counting their souls, making sure none were missing. Then he let out a small breath, and it sounded like it carried years with it. "I told you boys never to make a scene," he said, voice flat but not unkind. The tall one stepped forward. "You didn't make the scene, sir. We did, and I'd do it again," he added, "not for show, not for them, but for you, because that shop needed to remember what respect looks like." Royce shook his head, but there was no anger, just weariness, the kind that only comes after a lifetime of holding others up while the world looks the other way. He didn't like being the center of anything, never had, even when his name had briefly crossed lips in Dodd halls. Even when officers whispered that the ghost from Kandahar had saved another unit, he preferred shadows, not spotlights, discipline, not drama. Still, he looked down at the M1 and gave it a small nod as if telling it welcome back, and maybe he was maybe. The rifle had waited all this time in that case behind glass for the hands that once carried it through jungle and dust storm and snowy ridgeline. Maybe it too had missed the quiet strength of the man who never left a teammate behind. What now, Royce asked, his voice softer now, but every word still landing like iron on stone. "You boys had your say, they had their moment. Now you gonna go back to your lives like nothing happened." Tall seal hesitated, glanced at the others, then looked back at Royce. "We were talking about that on the way over, sir. It's been a long time since we saw each other, not just in passing, but really saw each other." One of them spoke up from the side. "Maybe it's time we stopped pretending we're all just fine out there on our own. Maybe it's time we bring the team back, even if just for a while." Royce studied them, eyes sharp beneath the quiet lines of age and sand and command. He nodded once, slow, measured. "Maybe," he said, "maybe that's not a bad idea." Stood there on the sidewalk like an old tribe gathering again after seasons apart. The streets were beginning to empty now as the sun dipped behind the rooftops, shops closing, lights fading, the air cooler with the whisper of coming night, and still none of them moved. Then Royce stood, his back straight, shoulders squared, not from pride but from habit, his boots hitting the concrete with that same steady cadence they had known in training and missions. In every step behind enemy lines, he turned away from the bench, rifle still in hand, and said, "Let's go, boys. We got a lot to talk about, and maybe not as much time as we think." They followed without question, falling into step behind him naturally, instinctively, the way they always had, and they didn't ask where he was leading them, because some men don't need to explain direction. They are the compass. They walked past the gun shop again, the windows now dim, the door locked, the clerk probably still inside, unsure of what to do with the silence that had taken his place. No one looked back, no one needed to. The point had already been made, and some lessons are better learned in stillness. A few blocks down, Royce turned into a narrow side street, then into a garage tucked between to buildings, the kind of place only someone local would know about, the kind of place you pass 100 times without seeing inside. The lights were dim, but the inside was neat, orderly, shelves lined with gear, a small workbench, a couple of stools A cooler in the corner, and on one wall a large faded American flag with a single bullet hole near the edge. "Welcome home," Royce said simply as he opened the door and stepped inside. The others followed, slowly looking around, some smiling, some falling silent again, but every one of them knowing exactly what this place was and what it meant. This was the room where they used to meet during leave. This was the quiet bunker where they had celebrated survival and mourned the fallen, where they had told stories without needing to finish them and passed around the weight of grief without saying a word. One of the younger men walked to the workbench and ran his hand across the worn surface. "Still has your mark on it," he said softly. "Still smells like gun oil and black coffee and old boots." Royce sat on a stool near the flag, set the M1 down gently like a sacred object, then leaned back and looked at each of them in turn. "You know why we lasted as long as we did?" he asked. No one answered, because they knew the question was for more than just answering base. "We didn't let the world tell us who we were," he said. "We didn't let anyone define us by our age or our scars or our silence. We defined ourselves by how we showed up when it mattered, by what we carried, by who we refused to leave behind." He nodded, not all at once, but in that slow, solemn way that says you're not agreeing, you're remembering. Royce leaned forward, eyes sharp again, steel beneath the dust. "Now let's talk," he said. "We've got stories that haven't been told and things that still need saying, and no more pretending. We're just fine." And as they began to speak again in that hidden room beneath the city, their voices low but full of weight, it became clear that the mission wasn't over, that some wars never really end, and some men are never truly done fighting, not with bullets, but with memory, with honor, with prison. Seth's room was thick with smoke from a cigarette none of them had lit, but everyone could feel it, the heavy invisible haze of stories half told and memories sharper than any bullet wound. The walls seemed to close in, but the men welcomed it because it meant they were still here, still breathing, still carrying the weight that no one outside could understand or see. Samuel Royce ran his fingers along the edge of the workbench, tracing the gouges and stains left by years of battle and brotherhood and sacrifice. His eyes distant but never unfocused. It was his voice that broke the silence, not loud but steady like a drumbeat in the quiet night. "The truth is, most people think war ends when the fighting stops, when the guns go silent, but we all know it never really ends. It just moves inside us like a shadow, always there, always watching, always waiting for a crack, for a moment when you let your guard down and it slips." And again the younger men looked at each other, some nodding, others swallowing hard, some eyes burning with memories too fresh to name. One of them spoke up, his voice raw like gravel. "I still hear the screams, sir. Sometimes at night I wake up and they are there, the faces of the ones I couldn't save, the ones who left early. It's like a weight on my chest I can't shake." Royce didn't say anything for a moment, just looked out the small window at the city lights far away, and then said, "I hear them too. I see them in my dreams like ghosts who never learned to leave the living behind. We carry their stories with us like a second skin. Sometimes it fits and sometimes it suffocates." One of the oldest among them spoke next, his voice low and steady. "We try to put on armor outside, but inside sometimes we're just boys, scared and broken, trying to pretend we're not falling apart, but it's the brotherhood that holds us together, the invisible chain that links us even when we're miles apart, even when the silence grows between us." The room grew quieter and the air thicker, as if the walls themselves were listening, leaning in to catch every word, every breath. The youngest SEAL looked at Royce and said, "What do we do with all this pain, sir? How do we keep walking forward when some days it feels like it's pulling us under?" Royce closed his eyes for a moment, and when he opened them, they burned with quiet fire. He said, "We find purpose in the pieces we thought were broken. We build new strength from the rubble of what we lost. We do not let the silence win. We speak the names. We carry the stories that refuse to die, because as long as we remember they live." A long pause settled over the room. Then the tall SEAL reached into his pocket, pulled out a crumpled photo, handed it to Royce. The image was faded, but the smiles were clear. The team younger, cleaner, their faces bright With hope and reckless confidence, Royce looked at it and smiled faintly, like seeing a ghost that finally found its way home. "You all thought we'd walk away from this," the younger man said, "but the truth is we never did. It's been with us every day, every mission, every quiet moment. Between the noise, the brothers we lost, the promises we made, the futures we traded for a chance to keep each other alive." Royce stood slowly, moving over to the flag on the wall, his fingers brushing the fabric. With reverence that spoke louder than words, his voice softer now, but no less sure. "There is honor in the fight, but there is even more in how you carry the scars afterward, how you live when the world expects you to just fade away, how you hold tight to the people who remember who you are when no one else does." Men gathered closer as if drawn by some unseen force, a shared heartbeat, a pulse that reminded them they were still a unit, still a family, forged not just in combat but in the quiet aftermath, the moments no one. The small garage smelled of oil and old leather and memories that were heavier than any weapon. The men gathered around the workbench, the faded American flag hanging behind them, a silent witness to everything that had been said and left unsaid. Samuel Royce leaned against the wall, his eyes tired but alert, like a wolf who had seen too many winters yet still held the fire inside. The room felt charged with something ancient, something only soldiers could understand, a bond forged in the fires of combat but tested in the silence. After the phaeton of the younger SEALs broke the quiet, his voice barely above a whisper but full of meaning. "Sir, what happens now? What do we do with all this weight on our backs, this history, this pain that never seems to leave us?" Royce looked at him and smiled, a small, slow smile that spoke of years and lessons learned. He said, "We do what we always did. We keep moving forward, but this time we do it together, not underneath." Others nodded, some with relief, some with hesitation, but all with the understanding that this was more than just a promise. This was a pact, a brotherhood renewed, a mission not of war but of healing and remembrance. Outside the garage, the city breathed in twilight, its lights flickering on like stars awakening. One of the men looked at the window, his voice low and almost reverent. "It feels different tonight, like the air itself is holding its breath, like the past and the present are finally catching up with each other." Royce laughed softly, that kind of laugh that held both pain and hope. "We've carried this burden for too long," he said, "and it's time to lay down some of the weight without forgetting the reason we picked it up in the first place." The younger men pulled out their phones, quietly scrolling through pictures, messages, stories saved like treasures in a digital archive of a life lived on the edge. One of them showed an old video, a reunion years ago, faces bright and alive in the sun, their voices laughing, carrying promises to never forget the fallen, to always have each other's backs. Royce watched it, and the faintest shadow crossed his face, a memory that didn't need words to be understood. The cost, the price, the moments when brothers didn't come home, the silence that followed that never really ended, just changed shape. One of the older men spoke next, his voice gravel and smoke. "It's not just about us anymore," he said. "It's about every soldier who walks into the unknown, who faces the darkness alone and hopes someone will be waiting when they return, broken, beaten, but still breathing." The room seemed to shrink and expand all at once, a paradox like the lives they led, always balancing between chaos and calm, between loss and hope, between war and peace. Royce stood and walked over to a cabinet, pulling out a worn box. Inside were letters, photographs, medals, mementos from missions long past, some faded, some crisp, all carrying the weight of lives touched and changed forever. He opened it slowly, letting the memories spill out like a silent story told in paper and metal and faded ink. The youngest SEAL stepped forward and picked up a folded flag, his fingers trembling slightly. "This is for my friend who didn't make it back," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "It's the last piece of home he ever had, and it's all we have left. Sometimes it feels like even that isn't an error." Royce nodded slowly. The flag was a symbol more than just cloth. It was a promise, a memory, a scar stitched with honor and loss. He said, "We carry those flags not just in our hands, but in our hearts and our actions, in the way we live every day for those who can know." The men gathered closer, sharing stories, quietly laughing, sometimes crying, but always listening, always honoring the unspoken code that bound them tighter than any order or rank could ever. Dathan Royce looked around and said, "It's time to make a plan not just for ourselves, but for those who come after, a place where no one gets turned away, no one gets forgotten, where the scars we carry become a source of strength, not shameth." Others listened intently, the room alive again with purpose and promise, a new mission born from old wounds, a future shaped by shared pasts. And the unbreakable ties of brotherhood outside, the city lights burned brighter now, a beacon in the dark, a reminder that even in the shadows there is light, that even in the silence there is a voice, and that sometimes coming home is just the beginning of a new fight. Night deepened outside, the garage windows casting long shadows across the worn floorboards and dusty shelves. Inside, the men sat in a loose circle, the weight of the day settling over them like a heavy blanket. Samuel Royce leaned forward, his hands clasped together, his eyes reflecting a lifetime of battles, not just fought with guns, but with memory and loss. His voice, low but steady, broke the silence. We've carried the past like a chain for too long. It's time to forge it into something stronger, something that holds us together instead of dragging us down. Royce paused, looking at each man in the room, each face marked by years of service, sacrifice, and pain. The scars they hid under layers of calumny of the younger SEALs nodded his jaw tight. He said, "We need a place, a home, not just a building, but a sanctuary, a brotherhood, a place where vets can come without judgment, without feeling like they're a burden." Royce smiled faintly. That was exactly what he had been thinking. It had to be more than a shelter, it had to be a beacon, a place where stories could be told, where the silence wouldn't eat away at them, where healing wasn't just a word, but a daily practice. As the others chimed in ideas, spaces for counseling, rooms for training, for gathering, for celebration and mourning, a place that honored the past but looked toward the future, a community built on trust, respect, and shared experience. Royce stood and paced the room, the idea settling in like a seed ready to grow. "We've spent years learning to fight for each other in battle. Now we need to fight for each other when the battle is over," he said. "This isn't just about us, it's about every veteran who feels forgotten, every soldier who needs a hand to hold when the world turns its back." The older men shared stories of times they had fallen through cracks, stories of friends lost to despair because there was nowhere safe enough for them to land. The youngest talked about struggles with the transition to civilian life, the silence, the loneliness, the constant battle within. Royce listened, and for the first time in a long time let himself imagine a different kind of fight, one where the weapons were words and understanding and presence, where the enemy was isolation and stigma, where victory meant saving lives, not taking them. He talked late into the night, their voices low but filled with determination, plans forming, outlines, sketches on napkins, promises whispered in the dark that they would build something lasting, something real, something that could carry their legacy beyond the battlefield. The room grew quieter as exhaustion crept in, but none of them wanted to leave this moment, this shared mission. It was more than a plan, it was a lifeline, a promise that they would be there for each other no matter what. Royce looked around one last time before stepping outside. The cool night air wrapped around him like a balm. The city hummed softly below, a world moving on, but he felt different, like the weight on his shoulders had shifted, not gone, but transformed into purpose. He thought about the old gun shop, the clerk, the M1 Garand resting in his hands, the moment when respect had been demanded not with words but with presence, and how that moment had sparked this gathering, this plan, this hopius. The men said their goodbyes and disappeared into the night. Royce stayed on the porch, a lone figure bathed in the silver light of the moon, his heart heavier but lighter to carrying the burden, not alone but with brothers beside him, ready to build something new. And somewhere in the quiet dark a promise was made, not just to each other but to every veteran who would come after, that no one would ever walk that road alone again. The days that followed were quiet but charged with an energy that only those who have lived through battlefields can recognize. The old veterans and the younger SEALs gathered again, this time not in the worn garage but in a small rented space on the edge of town, a place with cracked windows and peeling paint, but filled with possibility. It was humble, but it was there. Samuel Royce moved through the room, carefully inspecting the walls, the floor, the empty shelves and desks. He imagined What it could become: a sanctuary, a refuge, a place where the noise of the world would fade and the voices of veterans could finally be heard. And on a red team spread out, making plans, dividing tasks, some working on fundraising, some reaching out to old contacts, others designing the space to be welcoming, warm, and strong, a place that could hold the weight of stories and still offer hope. One of the younger men brought in a box of donated books, manuals, and journals, a collection of wisdom passed down through generations. They unpacked them slowly, as if each page held a secret, a key to healing or survival or connection. Royce sat down at an old desk, a surface scarred by years of use and abuse. He ran his fingers over the rough wood and smiled. "This place is more than a building," he said softly. "It's a new chapter, a second chance." Outside, the sun climbed high, casting light into the dusty corners and illuminating the faces of men who had seen too much yet refused to be broken. They worked with purpose and quiet determination, laying the foundation not just with bricks and mortar but with respect and love and brotherhood. At night, Royce often found himself standing outside looking at the stars, thinking about the men who had not made it back, the friends whose names were carved into memorials and hearts. He promised them all that this time their stories would not be forgotten, that their sacrifices would be honored in a way that went beyond ceremonies and speeches. Community slowly began to take shape. Veterans from different eras began to show up, some hesitant, some curious, but all searching for that same connection that the old team knew so well. The space became a meeting ground, a place of shared pain and shared healing. Royce watched as young soldiers and old veterans swapped stories, swapped advice, and sometimes just sat together in silence, knowing that in that moment they were not alone. The legacy of the past was becoming the hope for the future. One evening, as the sun dipped low, a former SEAL approached Royce quietly and said, "Sir, I never thought I would find a place like this, a place where I can be myself without masks or fear." Royce nodded, his eyes soft but firm. "That's why we're building this place is for every man and woman who has walked through fire and lived to tell the tale, a home where they can lay down their burdens, even if just for a little while." The work was far from over, but the first steps had been taken, and sometimes that was enough. Sometimes starting was the hardest fight of all. The sun was barely touching the horizon when Samuel Royce stood in the doorway of the new center. The building was no longer the tired old shell it once was, but a beacon of hope and resilience, a testament to what men could build when they refused to be broken, when they chose to carry their scars like badges, not as chains. The air smelled faintly of fresh paint and coffee, and something else, something sacred inside the rooms were alive with quiet activity, veterans moving through the space with an ease that had been missing from their lives for far too long. Some were laughing, others talking softly to counselors, or just sitting with a cup of coffee in hand. The walls were lined with photographs and plaques and letters that told stories of sacrifice and survival and brotherhood, and the space breathed with the weight of those stories. Royce walked slowly through the rooms, pausing at each group, listening without interrupting, learning what they needed, what they hoped for, what they feared. He saw the faces of his brothers, old and new, the future they had fought for, slowly taking shape in this quiet space, far from battlefields but no less real. Alone of the younger veterans approached him carrying a folded flag, a simple gesture but heavy with meaning. "This is for you, sir," he said, his voice steady but soft. "It's for the man who never gave up, who reminded us all what respect really means." Royce accepted the flag with trembling hands, the fabric rough and real and alive with memories and promises. He looked at the man and nodded. No words were needed. The flag was a symbol of all they had endured and all they still had to fight for. Outside the door, a group gathered for the opening ceremony, families, friends, and fellow veterans. The crowd was a mix of ages and stories, some faces sunburned and worn, some young and hopeful, all united by the invisible threads of service and sacrifice. Royce stepped forward and looked out over them, his voice clear and strong. "Today we mark not just the opening of a building, but the beginning of a new chapter for every veteran who has ever felt forgotten or alone. This center is for you, a place to heal, to connect to. find strength in each other and to carry forward the legacy of those who came before you. Spoke of the moments when respect had been denied, the times when the world turned away, the burdens carried in silence, but also of the power of brotherhood, of resilience, of hope, and of the unbreakable spirit that defines those who serveth. Crowd listened, and in their eyes Royce saw a reflection of his own journey, a mix of pain and pride, and the fierce determination to never let the sacrifices be forgotten nor in vain. As the ceremony ended, the men and women began to mingle, to share stories, to laugh, and sometimes to cry, but always to stand together as one family, a family bound not by blood, but by shared experience and unyielding loyal to later. That night Royce stood alone on the porch, looking up at the stars, the flag folded neatly beside him, the quiet hum of the center behind the walls, and he thought about the journey that had brought them here, the battles lost and won, the moments of despair and hope, the friends who had walked beside him and those who had been left behind. Reached into his pocket and pulled out a worn dog tag, the metal cold and familiar, the name engraved, a reminder of the past, but also a promise to the future, to keep fighting, to keep building, to keep honoring the men and women who carry the weight of war. Long after the guns fall, silent night was still and deep, but inside Royce felt a quiet peace, knowing that the legacy lived on, not just in memory, but in action, in community, in the unbreakable bond of brotherhood that would never fade. As the moonlight bathed the center in silver light, a new chapter began, one of healing, strength, and respect, a chapter written by those who refused to be forgotten, who chose to rise again, and who would carry the flame for generations to come.